Hello, my name is Jonathan Forster, and welcome to the Multi-Story Thinking Podcast. I'm an interior designer and educator. My job is to improve quality of life and productivity by helping people to create beautiful and practical spaces to live and work in. The Multi-Story Thinking Podcast takes an educational slant to the interior design world. So sit back, relax, as we help unravel the mysteries of interior design. This week we feature Caroline Buckingham, an architect with over 25 years experience in both the public and private sectors. Caroline established her independent architectural firm, Caroline Buckingham Architects, in 2013. She was a director and the head of educational design at Architects HLM, was non-executive director at Llewellyn Davies, and was the vice president of practice and profession at RIBA. I spoke to Caroline via Zoom with my co-host Kay Hanson from its studio space in the University of Plymouth. Like the first steps of architectural training, this episode comes in two parts. In part one, we discover how Caroline became an architect and the importance of engagement and developing a good brief, why social areas in school buildings are critical, and how to challenge perceptions with flexibility and adaptability, and why reviewing a roll of drawings is perhaps not the most appropriate use of your maternity leave. Welcome to the Multi-Story Thinking Podcast. I'm sat here with Kay Hanson.
Hi.
In Plymouth, and you're in London. Thanks for joining us. We don't really know where to start with you and your career because you've done so much. Perhaps you could give us a quick précis of your experience and how you got there. You're an architect, but that barely covers it really. But yeah, tell us a bit about how you got to where you are now, if you can.
From school, I was always interested in design and drawing and building, and all my hobbies were building go-karts, little boats, stuff like that. So by default, really, I fell into, when I came to do my A-levels, stayed at school in the sixth form, and I sort of hummed and hawed about going to art school. And then I think somebody said, oh, why not try architecture? And I thought, oh, I don't know. Or I was quite interested in interior design, actually, at art school. So I said, oh, I'll do a foundation. And someone said, well, why don't you do architecture? If you do first degree, you could go into interior design and specialise. So I thought, well, I'll give that a go. So it was really very relaxed. Sort of didn't have any family in architecture, didn't particularly know anyone. So yeah, went off to Sheffield University and stayed there, did my first degree, did my year out in Sheffield, did my second degree there, and then went abroad for a year to work in Australia. So then when I came back from Australia, I worked out there in an architectural practice, which was great, different experience. Son came from the north, that was a bit weird. And then I went actually more or less straight into being a newly qualified architect in HLM Architects. And so I was one of the first ones who started up a Sheffield office. Then I just sort of progressed through there. So actually in my career, I stayed in one practice for over 25 years. Every time I seemed to think, well, I might move on now, there's always something else that came along. So I started in Sheffield, then moved to London in the mid-90s, had a couple of children by then that were babies, worked in the London office, and then there was expansion, and I was involved in that, and then we were bought by an American company, so I was involved in that. So every time there was something you questioned what next, there was always some other opportunity on the horizon. Went from a small practice to quite a large practice at that point.
HLM are quite a multidisciplinary practice, and Kay, of course, has worked there as an interior designer. You've got architects, you've got technicians. That enables you to tackle lots of different projects.
It's great that we didn't sort of have engineers, although we did have specialist environmental engineers in the end. But yeah, it gave you a really good team. And I think that was always the philosophy, that it was always we worked together. It wasn't sort of one person who took overall sort of ownership. It was all very much a team effort. And the projects tended to be, we were very much more public sector work. So we were originally very well known in healthcare. So again, it was good for me because you got loads of technical experience on, quite complex projects, hospital projects, right down, to specification and the details you had to know too. So I think one of my first projects was some theatres for Northern General Hospital in Sheffield. And it was really, I had to do a 3-dimensional hand drawing at that time of the drainage. So it was, you went through some really detailed stuff to, then got involved. I think did quite a lot of housing at the early stages. At that time, they were building lots and lots of, the sort of housing estate layouts and stuff. So I did, got quite into the housing side of things. And then I think it was latterly, really, probably after I moved to London, got involved in sort of university work and schools. So and the practice did a lot of, government work, defence work, stuff like that. But that was sort of mine. And then latterly they went into more private developments like the commercial developments. But again, that wasn't, I don't know why, it was never something I particularly pursued.
You talk about drainage layouts and detail. Is that something that you want for the detail of things? Because I always kind of think that there are two types of architects, and some really kind of like to look at the whole concept and then perhaps leave it there, and then there are others that are really into the detail. I mean, there are some that do both, obviously, but they're really sort of nitty-gritty and nuts and bolts.
I really believe that you've got to, I think you're right, we all have, the great thing about any of our creative professions, we're all good or better at some things and not so good at others. But I think in that, particularly in architecture and probably in all those, when you're delivering something, you've got to know right from the start, right to the finish. I do believe anyone who delivers something well, even if it's not their speciality, will absolutely understand the details. So, I always, when people say to me, oh, there's design architects and delivery architects, I want to hang my head. I just think that's a terrible description, because they're architects or they're designers. You might specialise in one thing, but you do need to understand how you put your pen on paper from a blank piece of paper, your first idea, to actually handing it over with the keys. You've got to know the detail. So I'm not a passionate advocate of designers, just designers and deliverers. So should be joined up. And that's why I hate, I'm not a fan of design and build. I just don't think handing it over to a different team is the way forward. I think it gets compromised and watered down.
Can you just explain, just for perhaps some of the students that are listening, the differences between design and build and the challenges that you might have compared to a traditional project?
So any project's procured. So hopefully at the start, you get you're taken on to do the front end design, and hopefully that starts before they've even written the brief. So again, I think the best examples are where you've had a hand in writing or helping the client write the brief. You then take it forward to design. It goes to planning application. At that point, there's a massive sort of change in the last 10, 15 years, where powers above decided a more efficient way of delivering was to do what was called design and build. So traditionally, the architect would always be sort of the guardian of the design and would work with the client all the way through the project, and the client would be their paymaster. So they sort of answered to the client, and then you'd help write all the specifications, all the documents, all the details that then you go to a contractor to tender on. And then throughout going on site, you'd always monitor and answer queries and, hopefully quite collaborative and work towards a final result. Whereas design and build, it transfers the risk, I suppose, to the contractor. And also what happens is you can sometimes be novated to the contractor, so they become your employer, or sometimes you don't continue, and occasionally you are retained by the client as a sort of overseeing monitoring role. And then the contractor has its own design team, so it has its own architects, engineers, interiors, everything else. But it's the continuity, and I don't know if you guys as students are following the Judith Hackett report on Grenfell, and there was a massive discussion at the moment about the golden thread, and that's about sort of that thread from the start of a project all the way through to completion of ownership and responsibility and quality.
Yeah.
And as soon as that's broken, that seems to be where all the issues are happening.
No one can sort of pin the responsibility or take ownership of where those decisions have been made or lost in paperwork somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes, so in an original traditional contract, the architect was the contract administrator and was responsible. So you were the responsible person. And nowadays, so many other people are introduced into the system as specialist sub-consultants, different agreements. That responsibility sort of shifts. As there's no one person or one company. So there is confusion, and I think a lot of people sort of slightly, use the system, could say, to make, the focus becomes on time and cost and not quality. Yeah. So once that happens and it fragments, it really waters down the product.
It must be quite frustrating if you spend a lot of time developing a brief, developing a concept. If you mentioned that getting in before the brief is developed. Can you just talk a little bit about that process and also how you engage with the client or the end user in developing the ideas?
Yeah, if the client comes to you with an idea, it's so varied because some clients have loads of experience, have done buildings before, and have a pretty good idea of how it works, what space is about, light, everything like that. And then there's some clients who don't have any sort of experience before, haven't really thought, spatially they perhaps aren't as good at understanding, certainly not plans, drawings, CAD, everything else. So that initial part when they come along and say, right, I want a new school, say, and it probably is a senior head, the head and the senior management team will be sitting there, and they won't have ever done a new school before. So how would they know, how to explain how it works? So I love that part because it's our job to sort of give them, sort of say the standards and regulations, but to help them visualise how those spaces could be put together and how they could be used. Because most people will come from their preconceived ideas of what they've grown up with and their experience in life. So our job is to put things in front of them and think, oh, that is possible. Anything's possible. How can it work? Then it's being able to gather that information and put it into some kind of format. And generally, it is visually for us, whether it's 3D models or sketches or little presentations, videos to capture what they say and make that the brief. And then for me, as soon as you've got a really good brief, because then our job is to make sure everything that they've set out and want, is recorded properly, all the way through the process, you should always revert back to that and check yourself against it to make sure, we're very good in our profession at going off at a bit of a tangent and having a little new idea, and then you suddenly think, well, that's not what they want, they wanted. So it's if you don't have a good brief, again, it is quite hard to keep control.
In terms of how you work with your clients and your users, I've noticed a lot of references to engagement groups and feedback. How important is that in the process of developing new ideas?
Probably the most important.
Yeah.
The feedback, the client engagement is the most important. Well, in my view, everyone has a different opinion, but I believe, my architecture is about people. So, it's not a service. If you don't do something you're adding to what's required, then it's not for me to be arrogant and give them something they don't want. So unless you have that continuous collaboration and discussions and engagement, however that can be, it takes different forms. Then, when you finally come and hopefully you don't just do the building and walk away. Hopefully there's an ongoing relationship, because certainly nowadays, if you're designing anything, refurb or new build, that whole continuity is really important. So, I think people tend to forget the whole ongoing sort of operation of buildings and costs and everything else. So Again, we've got a responsibility to make sure that part is also addressed. So yeah, I don't know how if you're an operations manager in a big university, I don't know the ins and outs of how it works, but it's my job to find out, to make their life easier and to give them the best sort of solutions or the options.
You talk about early engagement and collaboration. Do you think it's wise to involve other disciplines at that point? Because architects tend to sort of lead the design team, if you like. But at what stage do you think interior designers, landscape architects, engineers should kind of sit down with the architects and the client and collaborate together on a scheme?
They all should be involved, yeah. And I think when we've done really good engagement plans, I mean, you'll remember, Kay, when we used to write our stakeholder engagement plans, and again, that was something we really pushed. We'd break it down into little bite-sized chunks. So any client or group of people sitting in front of you, you have to work out they can only absorb so much in one session. So as long as you break it down to sort of have maybe a master planning, the bigger picture, right down to, throughout the process, each session you bring in another discipline and you introduce it. And probably one of the latter ones is once they've got the idea of the buildings on the site, or if it's new, or the spaces, and then you bring in the interiors so they can visualise the furniture and fittings, lighting, how it all works. All of that, if you cover it, and landscape, that's the external spaces. Yeah, that is the whole brief. It's not one discipline or the other, it's all of them together. It might be they want to pursue a particularly low energy option, and unless you've got the environmental engineers right at the start, then again that sets the precedent for all of us. Because if I'm specifying the building, I need to think about the products. If you're specifying interior designs and furniture, you need to think about the life cycle of those fittings, the carbon impact, and it all, we all have to work together. In an ideal situation, it never happens. It's very hard to push for it, and that's because it's all driven by time. People don't make time for it. They don't feel that's important because it's not a tangible, I can't sit here and say, right, because I spent, 3 months in engagements with all the disciplines talking to the client, we get a better product at the end. My experience tells me you do, but it's really hard to, in this life, everyone wants everything to be justified. Yeah. So it's experience driven, but absolutely essential, yeah.
Clients not really understanding the value of that then, or they don't have the money to fund that, or the time, or a mixture of all those three?
Probably a mixture, yeah. I think understanding the value. I don't know how many questions I've been asked in all these submissions about demonstrate good value. But it's, and then the trouble is demonstrating good value often means money. Yes. So, and time is money. So people, and their time. I mean, lots of the clients, probably what most people that I'm dealing with, it's not the day job, so they're giving their own time on a project to help develop it, but they've still got to get on with their day job. So fitting around that, and also making it work in the right sort of timescale with the whether it's a local authority or government or whatever. You're always under that pressure. And certainly latterly, one of the things that was always cut out of things is that stage, because it's saying, well, you know how to design a school, just give us one and don't bother talking to anyone, and we'll get on with it.
Is education something that you're really passionate about, or is it something that you sort of drifted in and out of different sectors, and that's the one that you kind of a lot of stuff about?
I always wonder why I get everything I answer I'm so passionate about. Education is, I think it was, so although my family weren't architects, my mum and my grandparents, they were all teachers. So I was growing up, I was always around that environment, and they were always moaning about the smelly toilets or the cloakrooms, classrooms were really uninspiring, and it must have been in my head. So, and I also decided I never ever wanted to do teaching. It seemed such hard work for so little reward. So no, I ended up designing it, going in and and specialising it. But I just like the diversity of the people involved. I like dealing with kids. You get some really interesting views. And it's across society. So I just, that's probably why I've enjoyed it. Lately, I suppose I've been doing more community work and affordable housing, actually. Probably very similar, it's very people-centric. So
the rewards of education as a sector are just are massive, because generally they're coming from a space that's been unfit for purpose for quite a long time, and the facilities that you're providing them afterwards, it's just life-changing.
Definitely. I mean, it is. I think that, and if I think about it now, probably the same applies to a lot of the housing. There's a massive. If you think, we all went to school, so we all experienced that building type and those spaces and how they interact. So for us, all of us, it's really important in life. But you might hopefully never go into a hospital or something else, or an office building, perhaps. But I think that, and perhaps your homes where you live, is those two sort of areas, really influence your life and have a massive impact.
With the schools, what type of initiatives are you introducing that's making a difference to the experience of the users?
I have to say things have changed slightly. So when we were first sort of involved in it, everything I've talked about, that whole dialogue with the users and the pupils, was very much at the forefront. So whatever their vision was, they have an education vision, which they called a pedagogy. Our job was to translate that into space. So instead of looking at, somebody said, well, I've got, 11 classrooms of 30 kids, and, and I need a hall and a music room, and, the standard spaces. You could have those discussions with, to say, well, and again, it's you go to school and start at 9 and you finish at 3:30 generally. You eat lunch in sittings, there's a traditional model, but we could go in and say, well, what if we group some of those spaces together? Some of the way you work is about project work rather than, one teacher, 30 pupils, because that's quite insular. So you share your spaces. Why don't you have, maybe an eating zone, but that's 24, it goes on for longer hours, and it's got various options, because actually food's a really important part of a child's life and keeps them on site, if it's good. So we can have those conversations that really challenge whatever somebody's traditional perception is of a school building or a space. And why open it from 9 to 3:30? Why not open it 24/7? Why not share it with other people? Why not share it with the community or outside clubs? And why not have some housing above it so they can share it's all that sort of trying to make people think beyond, that sort of little slightly blinkered image. I have to say in the last few years that's been really challenging, because there's a massive drive just to there's no money for any sort of public sector anyway. I suppose the drive's just to keep on knocking them out, but they're more like I call it potato stamping. There's a school footprint and they just potato stamp them. There's no engagement, no thought, so that's sad to see.
And is that due to just lack of funds, or at one time there was a real focus about new learning methods and that was really kind of forward thinking? Has that sort of taken a bit of a turn, do you think?
Yeah, it's part of that is there's a whole drive towards, I don't know if you remember, Kay, we worked on the last project, which was for down in Cornwall.
Yeah. And
it was really hard to get time to talk to the schools and the staff and the pupils. You had a 6-week period to basically do the design from scratch, and because it's about what's important. So again, it goes back to my whole point about not having a good brief or a good time to develop ideas. If that's cut out, you're left with something off the shelf that you just reproduce. And that's driven lack of pushing a program. They're trying to, a lot of the school estate was in a bad condition, and they're just trying to build new stuff, but not enough money and under pressure to deliver, I suppose.
I remember on that particular project, the accommodation schedule, for example, was so rigid, and there was no sort of deviation or design flair that could be injected into the project, because everything was just so tight due to sort of funds.
Yeah.
So you get a standard delivery of a school, but functions, but what are you missing from not going that extra step to fully design and engage? What can you add by doing it properly?
Well, you're pushing whoever takes that space. You're pre-giving them how they're going to use it, really. Mm-hmm. So you're not giving them any flexibility or adaptability. So you're basically saying you've got 110 kids in your school and they will go into those classrooms. You can prove it fits and it can work in a timetable 9 to 3:30 day, but there's no, we used to call it the glue. There's nothing, no space, no, even in our own homes, you know, we're all, a lot of us, you know, certainly in our country, are very much sort of like our own kingdoms, don't we, in space, and we're always looking at ways to make those better. You know, we think of how well IKEA or someone's done and introducing, you know, things relatively easily, different lighting or outside spaces or balconies or plants and everything. But there's, you know, we were just putting some little rabbit hutches, then, you know, you're sort of battering out all the flair and innovation. Mm-hmm. You need to be stimulated. You need to have space to interact. You know, and I would say, depends on which sector you're dealing with, but certainly with children, they need space to play and interact and socialise, and they need good space to eat and feed, because, you know, that's part of how they exist. So you, in these sort of, by squeezing everything out, what you're doing is you're pushing them in, for instance, to eat for once a day for 10 minutes, because you're in a conveyor belt system. And that's not providing the soft skills for them. That's social interaction, you know, how to sit at a table, how to put your knife and fork out, how to eat, you know, that's can't be right.
It's such a shame, because the workplace is evolving to be completely flexible. People in the workplace are really pushing that element, and, you know, you can work in so many different ways. And that's really kind of, and the thought is that, you know, when students come from university, that's what they're used to. But if the schools are kind of taking a step back from that, where does that leave the workplace in 10 years' time, you know?
Yeah, it's funny how we go in cycles, isn't it? Because the office, when we were doing all the thinking of schools, and some schools have, you know, we've done schools that have actually managed to do some of that. And our office spaces, including our own space at the time, are very regimented, you know, in rows of desks, and we sit facing each other, and we have a little meeting room in the corner. It's funny how, you know, we've absolutely changed that, but only in the last 5 years, massively. Yeah. So the whole, and I think it was kicked off by the coffee culture. Yeah. You know, suddenly we could go into, and it was the Starbucks open, didn't it, first, and we all sat there, and suddenly we could get on the Wi-Fi and internet, and we could work, and everyone thought, oh, it's quite nice sitting on a bit of a soft chair and, you know, looking at your laptop, and now you don't even think about it. Funny enough, some of the office space I use is one of the work-life spaces. Do you know the bit I love about it, even though I go in and I sometimes have to sit in it's in a little office, it's the mixture. So you can have one desk, laptop space to a whole office suite. But when you go in again, it's the food, the social area, the kitchen, it's completely communal. Everything's provided, cereal, tea, coffee. It's not, you know, it's not abused. All different businesses, and I love the way that you can go and, you know, like trying to get on Zoom, and I'm talking to someone in there going, well, how have you heard of it? You know, it's all that mix. And again, you know, I benefit from, you know, the experience of all the younger guys and students or startups who know all the techie side, but they can come and ask me about, I'm thinking of a limited company and register. How do I set that up? Because I've had to do all that. So all that whole interaction is important all through your life. And so in commercial stuff, isn't it funny how we're there now, and on schools we've gone back to something that's, you know, just not, it's sort of just, it does what it has to do. Yeah, it's on the tin, is what it says on the tin, but no further. And and what they will do is, you know, they'll struggle because they'll get truancy, they go out more on the streets. In fact, I passed a school the other day, and all the kids were out in a local, one of those Sainsbury's local, hundreds of them. And I'm thinking, well, isn't that sad? They're not wanting to stay on their school site.
Their money off site. I mean, you could be encouraging them to buy things inside the school, and that would make a little bit of money.
Well, enterprise, yeah. What's happened to enterprise? Yeah, what's all the... Exactly.
You mentioned professional skills there. You've been part of Reba and run and directed companies. Did you learn that along the way? Is that something you picked up along the way, or did you have that primed in you earlier on?
I think you definitely learn it on the way, yeah, because you learn, every experience you sort of feel a bit wiser from. I don't know. I mean, I think when I was a student, I pretty quickly, I was lucky I went to Sheffield, and at the time the house prices were affordable. And I went, after my first year, I don't know what possessed me, but I went to the bank and said, can I borrow £10,000? Did a little business plan and said, if I get 3 students in this terrace house, which was £12,500, can you lend me the money? And they did.
Wow.
Back then. So it kind of, something in me must have had a bit of that makes sense. And the best, you have a little student house, we're all in there and we're all, doing our own testing, DIY and stuff out on it. And then, when you go into business, I think when you do your training, the business side, in my experience, and even when I've gone into, the teaching institutions, it's hard to see, or hard because you have to sort of feel it and experience it to know even.
I think, isn't it? At uni, you get taught less skills which you think, I don't know how I'm going to use these, But then 6 months later, you're thinking, God, I wish I'd paid attention at that lecture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
no, exactly. It's like you sit there and go, what's that about? And then the penny drops.
Yeah.
Actually, with me, it's probably a few years later. I thought, oh God, that was what it was about. So they, which is why again I think the courses now are tending towards far more of a sort of integrated, sort of like the old apprenticeship type of stuff, where you do some time in practice, some time in university, because it makes sense to go and test out what you've designed and reading about in practice and see what the reaction is. So no, over the years, I was lucky that I went through different situations of different company changes and takeovers and buyouts and opening offices, shutting offices, a lot of employment issues. So finance, had to deal with a lot of it. So you pick it up. So the issue, I think, for all of us in this industry is you forget what your industry is about. So for me, after quite a few years, it got to the stage where the amount of time I had in front of, alongside my colleagues and designers and in front of clients was, hardly any, because the focus was always on the business. Then you get to that stage thinking, what am I doing? Why am I, I haven't spoken to a client for a month and I don't even know what they're drawing or designing because, I just see snippets. And that's when you have to, it's the balance. So I think a hard thing for all of us is getting that balance right. Because we all start off, don't we, as designers? That's probably how we started. So, if you'd have said to me when I was 26, will you be running a multi-million-pound business and dealing with 250 people? I'd be going, no. It wouldn't have even been something. So it is difficult, and there's pros and cons. When I got involved, I think I was in one practice for such a long time. You do get set in your ways about things, and you see it from the perspective and the experience you're dealing with in that practice. So I only went and joined the RIBA because I was sort of asked to come along to represent large practice groups. They have like this little subgroups. I sort of went along, and the interesting thing was I was sitting around a table. I think it's about 12 of us, and all the others were from equal large practices, architectural practices. All of them slightly different. And it was great to sit there and think, oh God, all the things I stress about and worry about, they're doing the same, because generally, again, as somebody who, an industry that's supposed to be, we're a creative industry, we don't talk to each other very well much. So that was lovely. And then, so that was suddenly opened my blinkers a bit, and I thought, it's got a bit more going on here. And then from that, I suppose, I don't really know how I got into the next position, but so I didn't have any connections with the RIBA other than being a member. But then someone said, you need to stand for council. I didn't even know I remember Googling the RIBA and what its structure was. How does that work then? And I have to say, I was definitely one of the people who paid my membership to get the logo after my name. I didn't, didn't use it in those early years as I should. Anyway, so I Googled what council was, this little group. And then suddenly you're in a whole new world of having to go and, stand for council and have a little manifesto and get people to vote for you, which is, something again we're not used to in our sort of professional lives, are we? Yeah. So that again, that was sort of a bit of an experience, and it meant I had to talk to loads of other people in our profession, which was good.
Did you have an agenda of what you wanted to achieve, or did you just rock up and see what happened? Or?
You had to have your manifesto, very small manifesto. Yeah. And when you went to so for council, you just had to write this. I don't think it called a manifesto, but write it down. And it went to then it was basically published online because any member votes for you if they want to vote. So mine, I think my very first one, I was really passionate about. It was more joining up education and practice. So the architectural education with architectural practice. Because again, I think it's still a little bit the same. You do your training. We've just talked about that. You train. You learn. Great ideas, great inspiration. Suddenly, you're put into practice, and you're like a rabbit in the headlights. It's like, what does this mean? Why am I here in this practice? Why I'm in an office of 100 or 2, or that whole experience is not joined up.
Staircases and
drainage.
Yeah.
Drainage, yeah. But if you understand, you see, if you do your drainage for your operating theatres, as long as you understand what that bit is in the big picture, I don't think that's a problem. I think the sad thing is now is that they call them CAD monkeys. Awful expression. It should be banned, but it's basically taking students and putting them in front of the machines, and because everything is so data driven, they become very sort of data technical assistants rather than being able to so they can be working on that for months and not know what the bigger picture is. Some practices are very good, I'm sure, at explaining, but there's some who don't have the time to do that.
The dreams of changing the world with modern architecture are out the window, aren't you, as you
within the first month?
Yeah.
Maybe a bit of reality is needed sometimes.
Yeah.
I think, how do you, after your study, decide suddenly, because practice, I don't know about all the creative professions, but certainly architecture, one of the biggest, I never thought about until I was in the RIBA, actually. So majority of members of architectural practice are very small businesses, so they're less than 5 people. 80% of architectural practice are less than 5. So you're dealing with really a lot of very small practices against a very small amount. I think there's only like 5% or over 100 people in practice. So that, even in a business model, that's kind of vast, isn't it? So as a student, you trip out, go and apply for your jobs. How do you know where to focus or where you're going to get on?
You've gone from that big environment to running your own smaller practice. You haven't got 100 people in that back room, have you? No.
Fortunately not.
And that's a change in culture, I guess, and similar processes, but different scale, perhaps. And what can you sort of identify the changes that you've experienced from moving from one to the other?
Oh, yeah, really. There's so many good things I've learned from being in a large practice that helped me really be able to feel much more comfortable doing my own small practice. So I think for me, as I said before, in a large organisation, although I kind of had reached director and ownership, I wasn't involved in actually architecture or design anymore. So setting up another, a new practice meant, and I suppose I was older, so a bit, knew what I wanted to do and didn't want to do. So I set in my mind a few sort of do's and don'ts. But the best bit for me is I understood the business side. So the whole pressure when you're younger, setting up your own practice. A lot of architectural students historically used to come out and set up their own small, little sort of two of them get together, and their concern would be over, the whole cash flow, business side of it, legal side, because I knew all that wasn't an issue to me. That was sort of, I understood all of that. I sort of worried about getting work because, you're so used to working in a big team and everyone's supporting that work getting, how would my clients translate? But again, it's about making really good connections it's people again, if you've got good connections with people. I found suddenly they came forward, and there's always, ideally in a lot smaller zone now from what I was doing. So I was in multi-million projects, and now I'm in multi-pound projects. So it's just a different scale. But actually in the process of design and who you deal with, it's exactly the same. Yeah, there's nothing changed in what I do or how I feel about things. But I can choose. So everything I preach and say, well, you need to spend more time in briefing, that's what I aim my business at.
Yeah.
So if I come across a client who just wants me to rubber stamp I say, well, I'm probably not the person for you.
Yeah.
So being brave enough to say no is it's hard. But I'm older, I don't, my children have grown up, I don't have, I thought, well, if I've got to earn a bit of money, I can probably go and do something. It's a different sort of pressure in your life. And I love working. I do a lot of collaboration with other disciplines, so that sort of works as well.
Thinking about the scale of the buildings, you get more intimate relationship with the design process then, or the detailing? And
oh, yeah. Yeah.
I noticed on your website some lovely pictures of components that are part of structures which look like they've been designed bespokely, that's the right word, bespoke components for roof sections, and you're getting that hands-on design that maybe you weren't having in your previous practice.
Yeah, I think now, I don't have to do everything. That is a hard bit, actually, because suddenly you're so used to people around you being good at stuff, and I said we all have strengths and weaknesses, and you have to now start from doing a nice little sketch master plan right down to being able to do the detail to make it waterproof. But I love that, and it's been quite a challenge, and really hands-on, definitely hands-on. Therefore you have more client contact. You have more contact with your other designers. I make sure that we have time to discuss things and talk about it, get the best solution. So it's really rewarding from that point of view.
I think once you've put yourself in that position as well, it's really scary and daunting to do something new or different or to a big audience. But once you've done it, it's kind of like, oh, well, that wasn't so bad, It kind of turned out all right, even if you either didn't win the pitch or, stumbled over a few words. Nothing really bad happened. And to do it the next time, it's kind of like, oh, it's okay. It's not so scary.
We all get nervous. There's nobody I could look around really who doesn't get nervous, whatever that level of pitch is or presentation or speech. But you're right. I would say you've got to go for it, because, I always say we've done pitches together, and you always go and you think, well, no one's going to die.
Yeah.
What's the worst that can happen?
Yeah.
There's nothing, everyone might sort of be a bit bored if I deliver a presentation. It's not uplifting but you learn from that. You can, the more you do it, the better you do become at it.
The profession is male dominated, and has that affected the way you've had to operate? It's
difficult now to think about it, because obviously my generation era, it was a completely different sort of time to now. But now in universities it's 50-50 going into train in architecture. Probably in interiors it's probably even more female, I'd imagine. But anyway, it's very balanced, and I think that generation is very aware of equality and everything, and diversity. I think still the big issue is the amount of dropout. So although it starts off equally, for whatever reasons, the girls do drop out And certainly after the first, the part one, the first degree, that it starts to reduce, and then a lot of them never go on to qualify. So I guess in general practice for females, it's definitely better, but I just think, there's still a demand, a pressure on long working hours. Unfortunately, the pay is not brilliant. So, the usual, if you're going to decide you want children, then, you might as well, you're more or less paying to go to work by the time you look after childcare. All these issues.
Is architecture as a profession renowned for long working hours? I think that's the perception I seem to pick up, both at uni. This is going to be hard work. You're going to be working, forget your social life, but also once you're in industry.
I remember a story that you once told me, Caroline, about you just had your son, I think it was, and someone came round with a roll of drawings for you to sit and look over.
So I'd like to think of the future and how it will be for women. But yeah, when I was, I chose to have children, and you kind of, you don't know what it brings, but you make your choice. Yeah, and I think we had 6 weeks maternity back then. And yeah, I think I'd only just got home with him and his, in his little whatever, sitting asleep. Yeah, and they came after 2 weeks, came around with a roll of drawings. Well, he's asleep, you can get on and
yeah,
use the drawings for it. You didn't think about it.
Once you kind of achieved the directorship and ownership of a business, is that more of a male-dominated environment at the very top of business?
Yeah, without a doubt, and that does need to be changed. So yes, although isn't that amazing? We go in at 50-50, and yet I don't know what the stats are. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's really poor, the female representation in architectural practices, or in any creative, in most businesses, to be honest, isn't it? Yeah. And when they did, I know at the RIBA I was involved in the gender pay gap review and report, and I think lots of people didn't quite understand exactly what it meant, but because it does depend on your organisation, so you may think, we're doing really well, we've met those kind of that everyone's equal, but what nobody's taking into account, that's equal in the positions they're in, whereas at the top end it was completely unequal because it was 9 males and 1 female. So I don't know if it harks back to that sort of traditional nature of architecture, which is, it's probably sort of different from some of the other disciplines, like interiors, where even when I qualified, it was very, I don't know, I would say, not in a bad way, but the majority of people I started out with were probably from reasonably privileged backgrounds, had a bit of money. And you were training for so long, there wasn't many opportunities to get supported. I was lucky I had a full grant when I went to university in those days, so I had a really good support. But yeah, it was very much of the old boys club, and a lot of it was your sons went into it, so and some of that, there's a little bit of that around. Hopefully, I think as things become far more flexible, connected, everything else, there's no reason why anyone of any whatever, wherever they come from, can't achieve what they need to now. I don't think it's, the barriers are there.
Thanks to Caroline for taking the time to talk to us. Caroline mentioned the importance of creating a brief and how engagement with your client and user groups can help to form a really strong starting point for the design development. At Multi-Story Thinking, we used engagement processes with both students and employees in businesses. And at the University of Plymouth, we've been teaching our students how to use those engagement and co-design techniques to help develop concepts that are more closely aligned with what the people actually want. If you'd like to find out more about that, please get in touch. As I said earlier, that was part 1, and part 2 will be coming out shortly, where there's more chat with Caroline and Kay. I'd like to thank Kay for her help in setting up the podcasts and her co-hosting role. Also, Dave Clark from I Am The How for his technical support in the setting of the podcasts. And Mark Frith for the music. There's some links and bump in the show notes. Thanks for listening. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.